Who killed and what really happened to Chris Benoit? In June of 2007, a professional wrestler killed his wife, killed his 7-year-old son, and then killed himself. WWE's first move was to go on air and call it a tragedy. Their second move, less than 24 hours later, was to quietly call it something else entirely and pull his name from their own history. Doctors who studied his brain afterwards said it looked like an 85-year-old with Alzheimer's. He was 40. So what actually happened in that house? Was this the man, or was it what wrestling had done to his brain for 22 years? By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what the evidence says. And it's not what either side wants you to believe. On the night of June 25th, 2007, WWE was scheduled to air a live pay-per-view. Chris Benoit was supposed to be on the card, but he never showed up. Not at the arena, not at the hotel, not anywhere. So WWE pulled him from the show and moved on, figuring he'd call in sick like wrestlers sometimes do. Then the phone call came. Police in Fayette County, Georgia had found 3 bodies inside Benoit's home: Chris, his wife Nancy, and their 7-year-old son Daniel. WWE's response was immediate. They dedicated the following night's Monday Night Raw to a 3-hour tribute, replaying his greatest matches, letting wrestlers cry on camera about losing a friend. But less than 24 hours after that tribute aired, investigators revealed the actual cause of death. And WWE didn't just cancel the rerun. They scrubbed his name from their website, pulled his merchandise, and never aired that tribute again. A company doesn't erase a 3-hour broadcast overnight for a simple tragedy. Therefore, something in that investigation changed everything they thought they knew. So what did the police actually find inside that house? Investigators determined Benoit had strangled Nancy, then suffocated Daniel, then hanged himself using a cord from his own weight machine 2 days later. Bibles were found placed next to both bodies, but almost immediately before autopsy results were even back, the public and much of the media had already landed on an explanation: roid rage. It made sense on the surface. Wrestling had a well-known steroid culture, and Benoit was a bodybuilder's build on a smaller frame. So networks ran with it. Congressional hearings on steroids in sports got louder, and WWE's wellness policy, barely a year old at the time, came under immediate fire. But here's the problem. When the toxicology results actually came back, Benoit's testosterone levels weren't the smoking gun everyone expected. They were elevated, but not to a degree that most toxicologists considered capable of triggering this kind of sustained, methodical violence over multiple days. Therefore, if it wasn't simply steroids, something else had to explain a change this severe in a man everyone described as calm, quiet, and unusually gentle backstage. So his family made an unusual decision. They asked scientists to open up something nobody had thought to check: his brain. Benoit's father contacted the Sports Legacy Institute, and neuropathologist Dr. Bennett Omalu, the same doctor who had first identified this disease in NFL players, was given permission to examine Chris Benoit's brain tissue. What he found stunned even him. The brain showed advanced chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, a degenerative disease caused by repeated blows to the head, and it wasn't isolated to one region. It was found throughout his brain. Omalu compared the tissue damage to that of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. Benoit was 40, but CTE isn't just memory loss. Omalu explained that the disease specifically damages the limbic system, the part of the brain that regulates emotion and impulse control. So the same brain region responsible for keeping violent, irrational impulses in check had been so severely deteriorated that experts said uncharacteristic, aggressive behavior became a real medical possibility. Therefore, the question stopped being, was this steroids, and became something much harder to sit with. How does a professional wrestler's brain end up looking like this in the first place? Professional wrestling is scripted, but the impact isn't fake. Chair shots to the head, unprotected falls onto the mat and ring apron, botched moves that go wrong in front of thousands of people who can't know it, went wrong. For over 2 decades, Chris Benoit built his entire reputation on a wrestling style built around headbutts and diving maneuvers, including his signature move, a diving headbutt off the top rope, delivered headfirst hundreds of times across his career. Nobody was tracking concussions in wrestling the way football eventually would. There was no concussion protocol, no baseline testing, no games missed for head injuries. Wrestlers were expected to perform hurt night after night in over 200 shows a year. But Omalu's report on Benoit came out in 2007, 2 years before the NFL's own concussion crisis exploded on Capitol Hill. So Benoit's brain didn't just explain one tragedy, it became one of the earliest, most alarming pieces of evidence that any full contact sport, not just football or boxing, could produce this same catastrophic damage. Therefore, wrestling promotions everywhere, including WWE, were suddenly facing a question they'd never had to answer publicly before. How many other wrestlers were walking around with brains like this and just didn't know it yet? Here's where this story gets uncomfortable, and it deserves to be said directly. CTE is real. It was found in Benoit's brain in an advanced state, and it can cause impaired judgment and violent impulses. But a brain disease is not a legal defense, and it is not a moral excuse. Nancy Benoit and Daniel Benoit did not deserve to die, and no diagnosis changes what was done to them. What CTE offers isn't forgiveness, it's context. It helps explain how a man widely described by colleagues as soft-spoken, private, and devoted to his son could become capable of an act this violent. But it does not erase the fact that a 7-year-old boy and his mother are the ones who paid for it. So two things are true at the same time here, and neither cancels out the other. This was a horrific act of domestic violence and child murder, and it likely happened inside a brain that had been catastrophically damaged by the very sport that made him famous. Therefore, the real legacy of this case was never really about Chris Benoit as a wrestler at all. So what actually changed in the industry because of it? WWE's wellness policy, which had only existed since 2006, was overhauled. More frequent drug testing, mandatory cardiac screenings, and stricter concussion evaluation protocols followed in the years after. Wrestlers who once worked through head injuries because that's just what you did suddenly had a documented, published case proving that ignoring those hits could end in something like this. But the bigger shift happened outside wrestling entirely. Benoit's case, released the same year as early NFL brain studies were gaining traction, became one of the first widely publicized examples that CTE wasn't a football problem. It was a repeated head trauma problem, one that could show up in any sport that involved it. Congressional hearings on head injuries in football 2 years later directly reference findings from cases like his. So, a case that started as a murder investigation ended up reshaping how doctors, leagues, and athletes across multiple sports thought about brain trauma for the next 2 decades. Therefore, the real answer to what happened to Chris Benoit was never one single thing. It was steroids that weren't quite enough to explain it. A brain disease that offered context but not innocence, and an industry that had no idea what it had been doing to its own athletes until it was far too late. Nancy and Daniel Benoit deserve to be remembered as the victims they were, not a footnote in a wrestler's biography. And Chris Benoit's brain deserves to be remembered for what it proved, that the damage this sport could cause was worse than anyone, including WWE itself, had ever been willing to admit. So the next time you watch a highlight reel of the greatest hits in any contact sport, ask yourself the question this case forced an entire industry to confront. What is that hit actually doing that nobody's checking for?